Gabor, I'd like to first of all just express my gratitude and admiration to you for organizing this conference. You and I have known each other for quite some time, and I want everybody to know that I have enormous respect for you and what you've been doing at the National Cancer Institute and your organization to bring mindfulness more into the culture of Hungary. I consider you to be a very close and deep Dharma friend. And I really want to congratulate you and all of your colleagues in organizing this first conference on meditation and science, as far as I know, in Hungary, on the subject of mindfulness and compassion and the ethical foundation for all of this work, which is so important. And I know you're going to be hearing from a wide range of different people, some of whom I know quite well, some of whom I don't know at all, both from on the Dharma side and also on the science side. And I want to express how privileged I feel to be the person to have been asked to give the opening keynote. And also I want to pay tribute to your nation, to Hungary, and to Semmelweis and the enormous contributions that he and other physicians and Hungarian scientists in physics and math and biology have made over the years. I know some of those contributions very well since I've been a boy and met some of those Hungarian scientists, and I'm really thrilled to see in the unique environment of Hungarian culture, this confluence of deep Dharma and science and medicine coming together in this way to explore both the art and the science of meditative awareness, of wakefulness, of clarity, of compassion, and of wise living and healthy living. So you know, you said that we would have a guided meditation at some point during this 90 minutes that we have. I want to suggest that in the deepest meaning of meditation, the entire talk and your entire conference will be one extended meditation practice. Because if meditation is really about being fully present and being open to each other, as your introductory exercise invited us to be, then why not intend from the very beginning for the entire conference to itself be a profound expression of meditation practice? And I want to acknowledge the venerables in the room, the ones I can see in the front row and elsewhere, and just underscore that the conversation between Western science and medicine and contemplative practices has never happened before on this planet. This is the first time in human culture that we, as far as I know, that we are really in conversation and learning from each other about the deepest elements of what it means to be human. And that's my working definition of the English word spirituality, is simply what it means to be human. And if we don't know exactly what it means to be human, so much the better, because then we can investigate, we can explore, we can dive deeply into that question of the nature of self, of who am I actually, and what is it that I truly am during the very brief moment that we call a lifetime that any of us are here. And how can we optimize well-being and non-harming and taking care of each other and recognizing each other, even if we're very, very different and have different cultures and different opinions and different traditions, and how we can actually benefit from learning from each other and deal with our fears, deal with our greedy impulses to grasp more for me, for aversion, for pushing away what we don't like, and really in some sense, reconstitute the human metaphorical genome, if you will, so that we are our best selves, and that in the spirit of the Hippocratic oath that underlies medicine, that we first do no harm. That is the ethical foundation both of medicine and of mindfulness, non-harming. And of course, how would you even know that you are creating any harm unless you're aware, unless you can see the actual effects of your own behavior and even your own internal thought patterns and the facial expressions that might flit across your face, driven by unexamined emotions like fear or hatred or anger. So the real meditation practice is not sitting in the full lotus posture in a temple, although that's a very valuable element of the practice. The real meditation practice is living life moment by moment by moment as if it really mattered. So before we enter into the heart of this talk and our dialogue together, and I hope it really is a dialogue, and although I'm 7,000 miles away, I hope that there's a certain kind of intimacy that the technology is now allowing us. I've had this experience quite a number of times before, Zooming into conferences that I was unable to attend, much as I would want to. And hopefully, if you're in your experience, and I'm in my experience right now, and the technology is able to support it without losing me on the screen or my vision, the image or my voice, that we are together, even though there are thousands of miles that separate us. And that's actually a principle that applies to all of us, as if we as human beings are actually the cells of the one body of the planet. And the planet is sorely in need of mindfulness when it comes to the issues of global warming and the awareness of how much human activity since the Industrial Revolution is affecting the planet and various species. This is also part of the curriculum of mindfulness and how we're going to relate to each other as nations and as peoples. And so let's take a few moments to simply drop in now, to put aside your papers and your note-taking and simply drop into the experience of your body sitting here in the room that you're in, and me sitting in the room that I'm in. Put away your phones, your notebooks, and just feel yourself sitting here. And I'd like to also, before we go into this, apologize for not being able to speak in Hungarian, and appreciate very much that there is this simultaneous translation. And to the translator, thank you, thank you, thank you. The vocabulary of mindfulness can be quite tricky, so I really appreciate your attempt to carry the essence of what it is that I'm pointing to using my words in English. It really is an art form, and so deepest of bows to the translators, the interpreters. So can you sit in a posture now that, can you be aware of how you're sitting? Simply bring awareness to the body as it is. Don't try to sit up straight or do anything sort of artificial, but rather just bring awareness to the body sitting on your seat, or if you're standing, to the body standing. And noticing that you can do that, that's part of the human repertoire, that you can instantly bring awareness to the carriage of the body, we would say in English, to the posture that the body is adopting. And then let me invite you to now intentionally shift your posture, if you care to, with full moment-to-moment awareness, to adopt a posture that maximally embodies wakefulness and presence and dignity. And noticing if in shifting the body in that way, there is any kind of shift in the mind as well. And as you learn or cultivate residing in awareness, whether you're brand new to meditating and this is your first experience of it, or whether you've been meditating, as many people in this audience obviously have, for many, many years, just coming to rest in this timeless quality of the present moment in full awareness of the body sitting here, not alone, but in a room with hundreds of people, all with the same intention to be present at this conference. And see if you can rest in this awareness, take up residency in this awareness as your dwelling place, as your home. And just be here, let's be here together with no agenda whatsoever. Even the agenda of hearing some great talk by Jon Kabat Zinn. Just for now, feeling the body sitting here, breathing. Fully in this moment as the breath comes in, and there's awareness of the breath coming in. And as the breath goes out, and there's an awareness of the breath leaving the body. You're not thinking about it. This is not about thinking. This is about feeling and knowing, which includes thinking, but it's a much vaster, non-conceptual knowing that's being pointed to. And the beauty of awareness is that we're born with that capacity. We don't have to acquire awareness. All we need to do is develop access to it, which is very often clouded by the activities and the reactivity of our own minds and hearts. So another way to put it is, the invitation is to embrace silence, to fall awake, to be here as if your very life depended on it. And of course, you would not be attending this conference if you didn't suspect that in some very real way, your life does depend on the quality of your wakefulness, of your awareness, of your presence of mind and heart. And so now there's, as it says in the Heart Sutra, the great Mahayana text, there's no place to go, nothing to do, and nothing to attain, no special something that you have to get to be better than who you are, because there's no improving on who you are, because it's already boundless and beautiful and whole, W-H-O-L-E, complete as you are, including all of your imperfections. They don't begin to capture the full dimensionality of what it means to be a human being, especially when you align with what's deepest and best in yourself and drop into the present moment with open-hearted spaciousness. And so resting here with everything just as it is in this moment. Eyes open is fine. Eyes closed is also fine. whatever contributes maximally to your really dropping into the space of your own awareness that's already yours, already here, and can't be improved upon, only inhabited. So let's see if we can't actually invite ourselves to rest in this awareness throughout this talk and throughout your time together during this conference. There'll be many different presentations by many, many wonderful people. And you might actually look at all of them as different doors into the same room. Just as at its heart, in the contemplative traditions, whether you're speaking about Thomas Merton and his tradition, or you're speaking about the Buddhist tradition or any other contemplative tradition, to a first approximation, it might be useful to consider them all to be different doors into the same room. And the room is the room of the human heart. And even though each doorway into a room might seem quite different, the most important thing is to enter the room, not to stand in the doorway and talk about how wonderful our particular doorway is. Where it's Christian, Jewish, Jain, Hindu, Buddhist, atheist. And then to make differences between us and them, which is a kind of profound act of violence in a certain way, because it's ultimately dualistic. And it belies your own deep understanding of the non-dual essence of the nature of our own minds, the nature of wakefulness, the nature of clarity, the nature of consciousness. And so, in a sense, you could say that as a species, Homo sapiens sapiens, we're really in our infancy. It's only like 700 or 800 generations, all of human history and culture, since the receding of the glaciers in the last ice age. And it's not that stuff wasn't happening in the hundreds of thousands of years before that. But all of human culture as we know it has all come in the past 5,000 or 6,000 years, you know. And then if you want to throw in agriculture, then 10,000. But that's very few generations. And the human species, what we call Homo sapiens sapiens, the name that Linnaeus gave to us, that we've adopted as a species, it is, you know, the word sapere in Latin, which is the root meaning of sapiens, it means to taste or to know. And the Buddhists speak of the essence of Dharma, the one taste. And so if you want to know what a banana really is about, you don't read a 1,000-page encyclopedia on the nature of bananas and its chemical composition. You bite into the banana and you know instantly the nature of a banana. And so that's the kind of direct apprehending of experience. That's beyond this or that, or us and them, and liking and disliking. That's that non-dual awareness that we all actually carry within us, but it's never pointed out to us. It's never, we don't learn it in school. All we learn in school is thinking, which is wonderful. It's another form of intelligence. But this supreme form of intelligence, that awareness, which is larger than thought, because you can be aware of any thought, and therefore the awareness has to be larger to contain even the largest thought about a universe or a multiverse. We don't get any training in that. Until recently, in the United States, mindfulness is being taught in schools, starting in, with 5-year-olds in kindergarten, before kindergarten. Kids are being taught now to respect their own awareness and to learn to inhabit it, to become, in some sense, intimate with their own awareness, and to not get completely captured or imprisoned by their thought stream or their emotions, and reactive emotions in particular, liking and disliking and so forth. So if I could just say that this first conference in Hungary on mindfulness is really a symptom of a larger unfolding, a global unfolding, where the streams of Dharma wisdom and contemplative wisdom are merging with science. Let me call up the first slide, and the only slide in this talk, to just point out to you what's the phenomenon that's been going on that really is at the root of why we're all gathered here together today. That what I've done here is I have plotted, along with my colleague David Black from UCLA, we've been developing this graph for years and trying to make it as accurate and as conservative as possible. Starting in the year 1980, the number of papers in the medical literature each year with the word mindfulness in the title. And you can see that it goes along at a very, very low level for a very long time, until about the late 1990s, and then it starts to increase. And by about the early 2000s, you can see that the trend is really increasing, that it's accelerating, that it's going exponential. And by the mid-200s, it's going straight up. And this is, of course, evidence, if you will, or a kind of demonstration of the explosion of interest in mindfulness, not in the mainstream of media culture, but in science and medicine and neuroscience. So this is the kind of evidence that a new field really came out of nothing when we were able to bring mindfulness, which is often spoken of as the heart of Buddhist meditation. Nyanaponika Thera wrote a book called The Heart of Buddhist Meditation, all about the Satipatthana Sutra, which the Buddha himself called the direct path to the liberation from suffering. And the attainment of liberation. And now in 2016 and 2017, there are almost 700 papers in the rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific literature on the subject of mindfulness. And again, this emphasizes the point that I made earlier, that nothing like this has ever happened on the planet before. There's now a field in medicine, in neuroscience, in psychology, and in other disciplines, including economics and neuroeconomics, where the scientific study of meditative contemplative practices is going on at a very rigorous level. Does that mean that all the scientific studies on this graph are rigorous and well controlled? No, absolutely not. But even if 10% of them are, and it's at least 10%, it's probably more like 50%, then this is evidence that something new is happening on the planet that is worthy of paying attention to. Not in terms of like just being interested in the mind-body connection, but in really evidence that we need to start paying attention much more carefully to how we live our lives from moment to moment to moment, because it now has been demonstrated almost incontrovertibly that it affects not only our consciousness, it affects our biology, and it affects our sociology. It affects how we are in relationship to each other. It can affect levels of aggression and violence. It can affect levels of fear and anxiety. And it has a profound effect. It can have a profound effect on major depressive disorder and relapsing from major depressive disorder, as you'll hear when you hear about mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So this explosion is really a remarkable opportunity for all of us to ask, how can we contribute to this flowering of a universal, not a particularly Buddhist, but a universal Dharma in the world in ways that will optimize well-being and minimize harm and suffering and disease. And that's one of the reasons that, you know, have such respect for Gabor, who works at the National Cancer Institute, because this is the place where, as we say in English, the rubber meets the road, that we can actually take people with serious medical problems for which we do not have cures in medicine and help them in some way to understand the parameters of healing, which in the English language, at least, is very, very different from curing or fixing. And this is transforming medicine and the practice of medicine. And let me just point out that the words medicine and the words meditation in English, and you can hear that they are deeply linked at the etymological root. So there's never been a separation really between medicine and meditation, because medicine is really the restoring of what would be called right inward measure when it's disturbed. Right inward measure would be a way of thinking of health. And meditation is, in these terms, the direct perception and embodiment of right inward measure, which means that you can be whole even if you have cancer, that you can be whole, W-H-O-L-E, even if you are in considerable pain. And there are sutras in the early Buddhist tradition, before even the Theravada tradition developed. If you read the book by Bhikkhu, Venerable Bhikkhu Analayo, for example, on mindfulness in early Buddhism and how it relates to pain and suffering, that this is really available to regular people, not through acquiring anything else, but through developing that kind of access to their own deep reservoirs for learning, growing, healing, and transformation across the lifespan by cultivating mindfulness. Now, what do I mean by mindfulness? I said that it was spoken of, and it is spoken of, as the heart of Buddhist meditation practice. It is featured by the Buddha in sutras like the Satipatthana Sutra, as I mentioned, and also the Anapanasati Sutra, the awareness of the breath, mindfulness of the breath in particular. which is its own complete 16-step trajectory to liberation within the Buddhist tradition from suffering. My working definition of mindfulness is that it's the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally. And there's nothing Buddhist about that. Paying attention is a universal aspect of our being human. We're all capable of paying attention, although a lot of the time we're not paying attention, or we're not paying attention to what's most important. And in some cases, you could say we're totally blind. And the people who love us the best will often be very happy to tell us how blind we are, because sometimes our mindlessness comes out in the family more than any place else, because we've gotten pretty good at hiding it at work. But our work would be much, much more effective if we were more present for it. So it's the awareness that arises from paying attention on purpose, intentionally, in the present moment, which is the only moment any of us ever are alive, in which we can do anything, feel anything, express emotion, take action, and then non-judgmentally. And non-judgmentally does not mean that you won't have judgments. It means that as soon as you begin to pay attention to what's on your mind, you'll see that you have nothing but judgments, that all of us are like constantly liking this, disliking that, wanting more of this, pushing away that we don't want. And so we're continually off balance and driven by stress, by pain, by illness, by all sorts of things that we're trying to escape from. And we're really ignoring, which is the root of the word ignorance, the full dimensionality of our being, which is much larger than the narratives we tell ourselves about who we are. And there's huge evidence for this now. I'm thinking of a study that was published in 2007 by Norm Farb and Zindel Siegel and their colleagues at the University of Toronto. Huge evidence that the default mode network and the midline structures in the cerebral cortex dominate our experience. And when you train people in MBSR, in mindfulness-based stress reduction, for even 8 weeks, there's a whole shift in the brain, in the cortex of the brain, where a new network, that's a lateral network that they call the experiential network, comes online. And there's a kind of uncoupling of this network from that network. And there's a diminution of this thinking, developing narratives, stories that are always focused on me. And that gives you more degrees of freedom in navigating reality, navigating experience. 8 weeks of MBSR training. And that paper is, the title of it is Mindfulness Reveals Different Modes of Self-Referencing. How many of you are psychologists in the audience? How many of you are psychologists? Just can I get a show of hands?
Tegye föl a kezét, aki pszichológus vagy pszichiáter. John kíváncsi arra, hogy mennyien vannak a jelenlévők között.
Okay, well, psychology at its root is the study of the self. That's even what the word means. But we actually have no idea who we are, what the self is. When we use the personal pronouns I, me, and mine, for instance, we develop all these narratives about the past, the future, who we are, where we came from, where we want to go, what we don't want to have happen, all that judging. And then we get imprisoned there very often because we believe our thoughts when most of them, almost all of them, are completely inaccurate. And so that serves, and Einstein pointed this out in a quote that I won't bother to repeat, but that's in my book, Full Catastrophe Living, that we create this prison for us based on our liking and disliking, usually for a few people near us, to us, and not cultivating compassion for the world itself. So the gate, the doorway of the prison is open, but we tend to keep ourselves behind the bars when all we need to do is move out. So Einstein said that, The Buddha said that. Every wisdom tradition is pointing at the same thing, that we are in some sense our own worst enemy when we are not conscious, when we're not aware, when we're not paying attention, when we're not embodied. And then when we are, there's that exercise that Thomas Merton was speaking of, that Gabor invited you to engage in with each other. And then you're seeing actually the beauty in the other. And he used that word beauty. And I use it a lot. So another way to think about meditation, when you say formally drop in, and you establish yourself for a time in a disciplined way every day to devote to non-doing, to just being and watching the activity of your own mind and body and the activity of all your senses and the world itself. There's a way in which that is the gateway to wakefulness. And there truly is no place to go, nothing to do, and nothing to attain. And there's no you to attain it either. And when we learn to rest in the heart in that way, and as you probably know, in almost all Asian languages, the word for mind and the word for heart is the same word. So when you hear the word mindfulness in English, if you're not hearing the word heartfulness, you're not really understanding it. It's not like compassion is some separate discipline from mindfulness. They're the same discipline. There's the same cultivation. And so when you take your seat in the morning, for instance, as I do, and I'm guessing, how many of you, let me ask you this question, how many of you, raise your hands up high so I can see and feel it, have a regular meditation practice or yoga practice that you engage in pretty much every day? Raise your hands. And now look around the room. Take a moment to look around the room, because you see there are a lot of hands up. If we did this 20 years ago, there'd be no hands up. In fact, none of you would be in the room. Because look at what the graph is showing. 20 years ago, there was like no interest. There was very little. You would have to be very, very interested to have discovered those early scientific papers. Now it's exploding. So you can take the graph off the screen now and put me back up in full. And I want to say that when I take my seat in the morning now, after, I've been practicing on a regular basis, formal meditation practice for over 50 years now, which itself is very improbable for a New York City street kid. I've come to see those moments when I take my seat in the morning as a radical act of sanity and a radical act of love, along the very lines of the exercise that from Thomas Merton that Gabor had you do in recognizing the beauty, or you could say the Buddha nature or the original nature of each other's hearts and minds. And when we really understand the deep nature of the self in this way, and we see its essential emptiness, that's a huge contribution to Western psychology, because Western psychology has gotten nowhere near a deep understanding of the nature of self, which in my mind is much more like a strange attractor in chaos theory. In other words, a dynamical pattern that is never quite the same, never exactly the same, but continually self-similar, and has an infinite number of different levels to it. And that's already you and me and all of us. So when we use the personal pronouns, as of course we have to, we need to hold them with this kind of clarity that when I say I don't really know who I'm talking about. When I say Jon Kabat Zinn, that's just a label. That's not who I am. And it's hard to know in a deep way who I am. But it's easy to know that I don't know. And that's a very, very powerful place to reside. Because then it doesn't mean that I don't know where I live, or I don't, can't write my name or write a check, or, take care of anything that needs taking care of. But that in the larger sense, just as we don't know who our children are really, and there's something very beautiful about that, we don't know who we are either. How beautiful. Then life becomes an adventure. And the meditation practice becomes life itself, living that adventure, and it becomes a love affair. A love affair is always happy? No, sometimes we fall into unhappiness. We get attached. And when we get attached, we suffer. That's the fundamental first noble truth, and second noble truth, and third noble truth, and fourth noble truth. These are, in the Buddhist tradition, in the form of a diagnosis, first noble truth. There is suffering. It's not that life is suffering, it's that there is suffering. There's the actuality of suffering, and that a lot of it we generate for ourselves through the second noble truth, which is the source of that kind of adventitious suffering that dominates our lives so much, is grasping, clinging, self-identification. The third noble truth is so that's the etiology. The third is the prognosis, which is, so the first is the diagnosis, the second is the etiology, the third is the prognosis, and that is, there's hope for us human beings, that we could actually reclaim the name that we've taken on as for our species, the species that is aware and knows that it's aware. It's awareness and meta-awareness, not cognition and metacognition. Remember the banana encyclopedia versus tasting the banana by biting into it and knowing the banana in that way. So the third noble truth is very optimistic, because it says there is a cure to this disease. And the fourth noble truth is the treatment plan. Now, there's nothing particularly Buddhist about this. This is just a medical perspective on the nature of mind and how it generates suffering, and how the potential is woven right into our own minds and hearts for liberation. And so, to speak a little about MBSR, and that first paper that you saw on the graph in 1982 was the first paper that I wrote about the MBSR clinic at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center, which I started in 1979, and then wrote the first paper in 1982 about the effect of training in mindfulness on medical patients with chronic pain conditions who were falling through the cracks of the healthcare system at that time in our hospital, who were not getting satisfaction from drugs and surgery, or who had actually been failures to drugs and surgery. And we challenged them in the way I've been talking to you this morning, in the form of an 8-week-long course where you come to the hospital once a week for a 2.5 or 3-hour class with about 30 or 40 medical patients with every conceivable medical diagnosis, and sometimes also psychiatric diagnoses as well. We challenge them to do something for themselves that their doctors and their priests or whoever, their family members, much as they would want to help, could not do for them. Something that they can do for themselves. And what is it? Just what we've been practicing this morning, dropping in on the present moment and learning to befriend and cultivate intimacy and familiarity with this function we call awareness, that we never get any training in, that we never get any schooling in, unless, of course, you go to a monastery. But there's nothing particularly religious about this. This is core humanity. To learn how to inhabit what we call the domain of being, rather than just run around doing, like chickens with our heads cut off often, and not even know or even ask, who is doing all this doing and why? And is this what the best use of my time and energy before I drop dead and leave the planet? And so the potential for wakefulness was demonstrated in MBSR. And it slowly, over time, as we published more and more papers, it actually helped catalyze, along with other people who really cared about this in their own deep ways and taught it either in the Dharma perspective or in the mainstream, more mainstream scientific and medical perspective. This developed into the curve that you're seeing in an entire field that goes way beyond medicine. It's part of tech now and part of developing mindfulness apps and all sorts of things. And I like to think of this curve as, in some sense, and the work that Gabor and other folks are doing in Hungary as part of a global renaissance that's bringing together, for the first time on the planet, what's deepest and best about our humanity in something of a challenge to see if we can allow this possibility to emerge and flourish and heal the wounds that cause us to go to war or that cause us to be perpetually at war with ourselves. And at this point on the planet, we can no longer afford, to go to war in the ways that we've been doing, because we still have underdeveloped, you could say even Stone Age minds with nuclear weapons. And so we have to learn this lesson. The galaxy, the universe will not care if life on Earth goes in some horrible direction. The universe could care less, but we might care, and our children's 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 children might care. So this renaissance that I'm speaking of, it's not pie in the sky. It is already in actuality. That curve demonstrates in a certain way, because it really is wisdom flourishing within science and medicine. Can we now take this and bring it out into the world in ways that are profoundly healing and that also are profoundly ethical, so that we don't get on some big ego trip about now having, the one solution to the world, which would of course be absurd. But it's just one more contribution to doing medicine, so to speak, on what ails us, on the human suffering. Now, to speak more about the MBSR for a bit before we take questions, I want to say that the research on MBSR is becoming more and more rigorous. Those early papers that I wrote had hardly any control groups, and when we did have comparison controls, they weren't randomized studies because we had no money, and it's very hard to randomize patients when you're running a clinic. But nowadays, and I would refer you to the work of Richard Davidson and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin and the new Center for Healthy Minds that they have there, and also the Laboratory for Affective Neuroscience, because he's one of the founders of the field of affective neuroscience, or the study of emotions from a neuroscientific point of view. They have done 2 randomized trials with MBSR with an extremely rigorous control group called the HEP, or Health Enhancement Program, HEP, that was designed specifically to mirror and model the MBSR intervention over 8 weeks on everything except the meditation training itself. Because if you use just a weightless control design, it really isn't rigorous enough science now to say that there is a real difference. And in fact, when they look in these studies at how the MBSR group at the end of 8 weeks differs from the HEP group at the end of 8 weeks, they find that in self-report measures, there's no difference. That the people who take MBSR say, yeah, they're feeling much better, they're much more able to deal with stress and pain and illness and so forth. There's lower anxiety, lower depression. But when you look at the control group, they also report the same thing. They're also enthusiastic about their intervention, which just has to do with kind of lifestyle changes and being like, sort of more aware of their health. So that, in a sense, is a great equalizer. The interesting thing is that in 2 studies, the only 2 studies that have been done on the subject in their group, what they found was that biologically speaking, there were big differences between the MBSR group and the HEP control group. From the biological point of view, when they, in one study, injected capsaicin, the active ingredient in chili peppers that burns your mouth or your eyes if you get it in your eyes, and they inject that under the skin, you get a kind of immunological blister reaction. And they compared people after 8 weeks of MBSR training with people in the HEP program for 8 weeks, and they found that the blistering and the healing from the blister in the MBSR group was much, much faster than in the HEP control group, and that there were, the cytokines that were developed actually reduced much faster in the meditation group. So that's saying that there's actually a biological difference between training in mindfulness and just paying attention to healthy aspects of living in general, especially when it's just informational. The other study was just published a few weeks ago, and that looked at the brain and also using the HEP control, looked at emotional reactivity in an fMRI scanner on the basis of being shown emotion-laden or neutral pictures of one kind, photographs of one kind or another. And they were able to demonstrate that in a randomized trial between MBSR versus this HEP control, that the MBSR group actually had a much more reduced than you could say equanimous activity response in the amygdala, the salience and threat reaction center in the brain, so to speak, than the HEP control group. Another biological difference, and that they showed that actual functional connectivity between the amygdala and the regions of the frontal cortex called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex that has to do with salience and emotional regulation, that there was higher functional connectivity in the MBSR group than in the HEP control. So these are all biological differences which suggest that when you sit and practice non-doing, and you learn how to bring that into every aspect of your life so that your whole life becomes mindfulness in some sense, because every moment is a moment that you could be fully embodied and present and more compassionate within, including to yourself, then your body's different. And it's, it's not just your brain, and it's not just your immune system. Your genes are being up and down regulated all the time. This is this new field of epigenetics. And there's evidence that there too, meditators upregulate and downregulate large numbers of genes that have to do with inflammation and what are called proto-oncogenes. So that may be lying at the heart of why we get so much cancer and how we could even reduce our susceptibility, if you will, to cancer. That, of course, is not yet proven, but the epigenetic effects of practicing mindfulness, as well as all sorts of other positive health behaviors, there's no question that that's the case. And there's also a growing literature about what are called telomeres, the repeat subunits of DNA at the end of all of our chromosomes. And meditators actually show a reduced degradation of telomeres, which telomeres are shortened every time a cell in the body undergoes division, mitosis. And so it's a measure of biological aging. Stress accelerates the degradation of our telomeres big time. That's work of Alyssa Epel and Elizabeth Blackburn at the University of California, San Francisco. Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 2009 for her work on telomeres and telomerase. And now they're pouring energy into the interface between aging and meditation practice, biological aging. So let me emphasize that the time has never been better and the evidence never stronger and more rigorous for adopting mindfulness practice, as Gabor has been doing at the National Cancer Institute, and that probably many others of you are doing as well, and really investigating with the most rigorous science and at the same time the most rigorous ethical foundation what this is really all about. So it's a big challenge, a big unknown, and a big adventure, as I said, and ultimately a love affair. I mean, people who really go into science, frankly, we go into science because we love it. We love not knowing. We love trying to understand the mystery of the universe. And part of the mystery of the universe is awareness, is consciousness, is who we are. And another part of the mystery is, can we learn to live together on this planet before we destroy it? So these kinds of, the individual health of the human individual and the collective health of the body politic of the planet are not separate. And mindfulness is big enough to hold it all. And the promise of the science, if we thread that needle correctly, is that we will understand much more about how to live our way into the name, as I said, that we gave ourselves as a species, and the beauty that Thomas Merton was talking about in Gabor's little introductory exercise.
The title of the conference is Science and Meditation, Mindfulness, Compassion, and Affects. There was an article in the Mindful magazine written by you. You were writing about the relationship between mindfulness and compassion. Could you tell about the Hungarian audience? How do you see this relation?
Well, I think I touched on it, Gabor, but I'll say a little bit more about it. And then, I basically am finished with my remarks. You've probably gotten the idea that I could talk forever about this stuff. And there's so many different angles to it, so many different studies, so many different clinical anecdotes. This really is, in some sense, a love affair and a renaissance that we could all be engaged in that is of extreme importance. But in terms of mindfulness and compassion, the reason I said what I said about the word for mind and the word for heart in Asian languages is that it's really usually the same word. So in English, when we say mindfulness, we all, you immediately, when you think about the word mind, you think about thinking, because we're such terrific thinkers. And so what I'm trying to do by using the word heartfulness, which really isn't a word in English, but I just kind of made it up, and other people use it as well, is emphasizing that there's no separation between, in some sense, the head and the heart, or the mind and the heart. And it's not the head that has the intelligence and the heart that has the emotion. It's like we're whole human beings. And I didn't say this, but from the point of view of complexity in the universe, inside every one of our craniums is the most complex arrangement of matter in the known by us universe. The most recent estimate of the number of neurons in the brain is 86 billion. And there are at least that many, probably twice that many glial cells, and nobody really knows what they're doing in there, but they think that they may be just helping the neurons be more healthy. But that means tens, hundreds, maybe even thousands of trillions of synaptic connections, and your brain is continually changing on the basis of experience. So if that in some sense doesn't cultivate a sense of wonder and compassion and awe even in what it means to be human, then I don't know what would. We should be teaching this to our children because it would make science so interesting. So from the point of view of ethics, from the point of view of that paper that I wrote, and from the point of view of the relationship of mindfulness to compassion, as I said, it's often spoken of in the Buddhist tradition as two wings, one bird. Whereas I like to say many doors, one room. Okay, so you will go through the more classical compassion meditation practices or loving kindness meditation practices, fine. But without wisdom, loving kindness is not really so useful. If you go through the kind of wisdom door, you see it's not the door of non-duality. There's no separation. It is the Heart Sutra. No eyes, no ears, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind. No suffering, no origination, no stopping, no path. That's the Four Noble Truths. And they're throwing it out the window, so to speak, because that's pointing at the concept of the Four Noble Truths, not the essence of the Four Noble Truths, which is the actuality of things. And this goes beyond language and beyond languaging, and therefore beyond the word mindfulness and the word heartfulness or the word compassion. And this is where the heart of the practice lies. If people don't understand this intellectually, that's fine, because it's not about the intellect. It's about the heart of knowing, which is awareness, not thinking. And that's why we need to practice for the next, I would say, 10,000 years. Since we may not have 10,000 years, we need to practice in every single moment that we have the opportunity. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's what came out.
About the ethical aspects and ethical issues, because this is the other keyword of the conference. Let's explore the connection,
Sure.
mindfulness and ethics a little bit more.
Well, what I mentioned was that as I see it, the root ethical orientation of medicine is non-harming. Okay, and this was Gandhi's ahimsa. Okay, this was Gandhi. Now, in actuality, if you bring up the word Gandhi, you're bringing up a lot of complexity. If you bring up any hero, you're bringing up a lot of complexity, because Gandhi had his own limitations. He was only one person. And, apparently there is a whole shadow side to, many of our biggest heroes, so to speak. And an awful lot of killing came out of the revolution, the nonviolent revolution that he pulled off, which amazingly took India out of the British Empire. And they did it nonviolently. So there's certain elements of that, which ahimsa, non-harming, was the cardinal aspect of it. But as I said at the beginning of my talk, how would you even know if you're harming somebody unless you're cultivating mindfulness? Because you might not know it, or you might not feel it, or you might not sense it. So ethics is not adherence to some kind of code of honor, because everybody who goes to war thinks they're right, and the other person is not only wrong, the other side is not only wrong, they're not really human. So we dehumanize each other constantly, and then we think we're being ethical. That's insane. That's truly insane. So mindfulness is in a sense giving us a new opportunity to look deeply into our own greed, hatred, and delusion at the micro level of our own conduct in everyday life, and also at the level of how we behave in society and how our nations behave. And, we're getting a big, example of that nowadays in my own country. And whether the rule of law actually rules, or whether it's just, criminals, in power, and whether we care about each other, or we just dehumanize other people that we don't look like us and we don't like. So when it comes to ethics, this is in some sense, and I'm so glad it's part of your conference, because this is the kind of root question of how we are going to live on this planet. Bertrand Russell, who is a famous political activist as well as amazing mathematician and philosopher, he said, we've learned to, fly in the sky. We've learned to go deep under the sea. The one thing human beings haven't learned is how to live on land, because we don't know how to live with each other. And, you know, so there, we do have a history over these past 10,000 years of killing each other in more and more clever, highly technological ways. And now it's like cyber warfare too, and everything else. So we have infinite cleverness to destroy each other. What about taking that infinite cleverness and putting it in an ethical framework and foundation to actually enjoy the life that's ours to live? As the Dalai Lama likes to emphasize, everybody wants to be happy. I mean, there's nobody that doesn't want to be happy. But, and here's where the personal pronouns come into the ethics. If you don't know who you are, then your happiness may be dependent on acquiring more and more and more of whatever it is that you want. Often it's control, because you don't think you're sufficient as you are. So that is imprisonment, not liberation. And that can happen to individual political leaders. It can happen to countries. It can happen to the whole planet. And that was the thrust of the reason for my talking about that in the paper that you referred to. And I was saying, this is a big adventure and we don't know how it's going to work out. It's too early to tell. That's the title of the paper. And that's a quote actually from Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier, who was one of the great exponents of the Chinese, culture, the Chinese Revolution, 1949, who really saw deeply into the nature of universal Dharma and did everything he could to point that revolution in the direction of caring for what's deepest and best in us as human beings. How successful he was, I don't know, in the same way as how successful we will be in the next 100 years at taking care of what needs taking care of. We don't know, but as I was saying in my talk, that not knowing is really, really a beautiful place to be. That's where all science comes out of, not knowing, not being imprisoned by what it is you already know, because you can't discover anything new then. And that's kind of, for me, what it really means to be ethical. I once read or heard on the radio a great definition of ethics, which is how you behave when nobody's watching and you're not going to get caught. In other words, you're your own barometer for integrity. You're living life with full integrity. That's what the Dharma is all about. That's what the meditation practice is all about. If it just becomes some dime store relaxation technique that everybody's selling mindfulness now in one way or another, that would be a disaster. That would be the complete opposite of what the potential here is for the importance of this confluence of Dharma, medicine, science, philosophy, art, love that's coming together in our era.
What advice would you give to such a young organization like ours, the Hungarian Mindfulness and Contemplative Association? And we just adopted the Good Practice Guidelines, actually the British Good Practice Guidelines last year.
So first of all, I want to thank you for both putting my paper in your conference brochure and also putting those practice standards in your conference brochure. You're asking a very, very important question, because the more mindfulness explodes in the world, the more everybody thinks they already know what it is, and a lot of unethical people want to actually exploit it, and they don't even have a meditation practice. I like to joke that sometimes they can't even spell the word mindfulness, but they're out there selling apps or selling whatever, mindful hamburgers or mindful jewelry. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. This is the stress of success. This is a kind of diagnostic that things have gotten into the mainstream in such a way that people think, well, they can exploit it. And mindfulness then just becomes a word that will bring in money or will bring in attention or something. So the antidote to that is your conference, is your question, is the seriousness with which those of us who do love the practice or want to find out more deeply what it really is, underneath all those practice guidelines is one thing and one thing only, and that is practice itself. We need to stop talking so much about mindfulness and practice more. Okay, and then let the talk come out of our practice so that it's deeply foundationally grounded in our own direct experience. And we need to learn from each other. So we need to study. We need to read the ancient scriptures, not to become a believer in some tradition or other, but to understand, say, what mindfulness really is. What did the Buddha have to say about it? What does the Chan tradition have to say about it? What does early Buddhism have to say about it? What does Tibetan Buddhism have to say about it? And all of them have different things to say about it, but it's the one thing, and it's very beautiful. And now that this is moving globally, so that there's no more East and there's no more West, we are the people that have to take responsibility for the quality of the work. And we can't take the quality of the work for granted because we're a psychologist or we're a physician or we're an administrator or we have all sorts of titles and power. We have to actually practice. We have to anchor it in on a daily basis. And that is formal practice and informal practice. And as I was saying, we need both. The formal practice is time for non-doing, for being, that you give yourself every day as if your life depended on it, and not to experience some special state, because there is no mindful state. Mindfulness is the state of all states, if you will. It's that what holds it all, that is awareness itself. You already have it, I was emphasizing, so you don't need to acquire it, just need to learn how to inhabit it. And then we need to let our whole lives become the meditation practice. And then it will have the kind of influence in the world that the people who are hyping mindfulness, they'll find something else to hype pretty quickly. And that will leave the rest of us to do the work that really the world is not only starving for, I would say, but in a sense, you could say, dying for. And we've discovered that in almost 40 years of teaching mindfulness in the mainstream of American society. Nobody would have dreamed that medical patients in chronic pain and with a lot of stress and illness would adopt Buddhist meditation practices, even if it was like kind of universalized, and so that you could say it's they're adopting Buddhist meditation practices without the Buddhism, which if you understand about non-duality could be the real Buddhism or Dharma. And so this is the revolution that we're engaged in. It's an evolution, it's a revolution, it's a renaissance, and it depends on every single one of you in this room if anything that I've said or that you will experience or learn or share in this conference is meaningful.
Her question is about the differences between generations. She's working with kids and she's asking how, if it is easier for kids to learn this kind of openness and this attitude, like, for example, her parents.
Thank you. That's an absolutely wonderful question. And it's very important, actually. And again, this brings up the work of Dr. Richard Davidson, my friend and colleague at the University of Wisconsin, because they are doing a lot of research on children adopting mindfulness and compassion practices early in life, like 5 years old, 7 years old. And they're doing neuroscience studies on what they call a mindfulness kindness curriculum. And, you know, I don't have to tell you that we are all aware that it's easier to learn a language when you're a child, right? And so if you are exposed to different languages, say before you're 15 or 20, but even better before you're like 15, that you can actually acquire fluency in many different kind of languages, even, you know, Hungarian, which is one of the hardest languages to acquire fluency on the planet for somebody who's not born Hungarian. So it's the same with mindfulness, that if you are exposed to this young, since everything drives synaptic connectivity in the brain, the more you actually practice loving kindness, the more you actually practice being present, the more you practice awareness not only of your own somatic experience and feelings, but the feelings of others, the more likely you are to be able to actually embody a framework of kindness and clarity and care rather than a self-centered orientation of more for me. My paper needs to be at the top of the list. I need to be the smartest kid in the class. Or what usually happens is I'm not the smartest kid in the class. I'm the dumbest kid in the class. And then we create those kinds of problems for ourselves. And 40 years later, we're still in therapy trying to figure out why we're not who we want to be, when the irony is we already are. So that's a profound question, and I can't tell you how important it is to do this in a way that really honors that you're not trying to brainwash or idealize the meditation practice so that you're teaching kids belief systems, and catechisms that are socially conditioned, but a universal understanding of how to use the apparatus of the human mind and the human heart and the human body and our human interconnectedness. So thank you for that question.
Hello, John. My name is Otto. My question is, we will have two kids next week, my brother's kids, and first experience with kids. We want to teach something mindful for them. Can you suggest one or two very simple exercise what we can do with a 5-year-old kid?
Yeah, kids like to move a lot. So rather than teach them sort of stillness meditation, you can do kind of breathing exercises where you would stand and just say, breathe in and breathe out, and breathe in and breathe out, and have them do it together with them and have them feel, how does it feel in the body? And then you can practice that, say, when, let's say they get angry at a certain point, they want something, and you can say, hey, let's just drop into our breathing and have some big movement, breathe in, breathe out. And often interesting things will happen with the anger, like it will disappear. That's an incredibly valuable skill to develop in kids, where they don't have to take their own anger seriously and then wind up compounding it in their relationships with either themselves, because often we take our anger out on ourselves, which again is a form of violence, or on each other. So even 5-year-olds can learn that kind of thing. But let me just say this, because my wife and I did write a book on mindful parenting, which I'm sure has not been translated into Hungarian. But my usual advice for parents is to not try to teach their kids to meditate, because that's probably the best way for the kids to never meditate in their lives, because because they are so smart, they can feel how attached you are to wanting them to meditate. So the suggestion that I make is, if you have the impulse to teach your kids to meditate, just meditate more yourself and leave your kids alone. And they will learn a lot. They will learn a lot by watching you meditate and seeing how you deal with your anger, or you deal with your frustration, or you deal with your stress. And then they will participate on their own in the love affair, because you've taught them through being rather than blah, blah, blah with your mouth.
Hello, John. This is Thomas speaking. Thank you very much for your inspirational lecture. I have a question which might be a little bit scientific and off records here. How do you connect to artificial intelligence? Do you think artificial intelligence will ever be able to take this completeness, this wholeness which you're speaking about of us humans? Thank you.
Wow. Well, the short answer is I don't know. And nobody knows. But this is a big area of debate, is what are the limits of intelligence? And, you know, you could say a lot of our biological intelligence is artificial in the sense that, I mean, we still don't know from a scientific point of view how you get awareness out of all those trillions of synaptic connections. We don't know how that happens because this is material, this is matter inside the head. And then you get ideas and you get feelings and you get sentience. We're called sentient beings or consciousness. No one knows how that happens. But now we have so much skill at developing, or at least the beginnings of a field of developing sort of digital ways of relating to the world through robotics and through artificial intelligence, that and the simulating, if you will, of thought or emotion, that there's deep questions of how much simulation of emotion does it take to actually be emotional. I mean, people actually relate to their robots or to their, you know, toy digital devices in a way that's very human. So you project the humanity onto another. We actually have no idea, and this is a big debate. And there are a lot of people who are very, very concerned about artificial intelligence because, you know, and I would recommend you read the book by Max Tegmark, who's a professor of astrophysics at MIT in theoretical physics, called Life 3.0, which is all about this and also about the potential shadow side of artificial intelligence. So your question is really one that can't be answered, but is very interesting. But what I like to think of is, before we let the machines out and control the whole universe, maybe the most important challenge is for us to figure out who we are, because we're much more complex than any machine. It's hard to teach a robot to put away the dishes in your cupboard, or to understand the fleeting look on a child's face. So before we give our lives over to the robots, who are more intelligent and much more intelligent than us and may not need us anymore and may fear that we're going to unplug them, all these scenarios that people talk about, maybe we should see what it really means to be human and investigate not artificial intelligence, so to speak, but the question of whether human beings can actually be fully intelligent. So that comes back to Bertrand Russell's challenge to learn to live in a way on the land, in a way that honors what's deepest and best and most beautiful in our humanness.
Hi, John.
Hi
I
there.
have a very, very simple question.
Yes.
Okay, I'm standing because it's better than. Yeah, I'm a biologist and I have a very, very simple question because I am living a very busy life like others. I am running and I am very busy with work, so it's very hard to meditate in this world.
Yeah.
And the music was the one point that it helps me a lot to concentrate myself, and it wasn't very effective if I was trying look to me and meditate only in the night, and it wasn't so good. So how do you think the music could help in the meditation, and what is your experience in this field? Thank you very much.
Well, let me ask you a question first. When you're listening to the music, are you just listening to the music, or are you doing other things while you're listening to the music, like working?
No, just listening to music, and I'm trying.
Well, if you're just listening and just hearing, then are you also at times dropping underneath thinking so that you're aware of thinking, but you're not caught up in the thought stream?
I'm trying not thinking. I'm trying.
Well, trying not thinking is problematic, because then you're in some sense, the trying is a problem, because then the thinking is so powerful you know, you're going to fail at trying to not think. But my question,
guide how can I handle
okay.
how can I handle my
So music is fine, but unless you're carried away by the music into thought. So if you can bring awareness to hearing the notes and the space between the notes, the silence, because you can't have music without silence, then you can rest inside and underneath and in the music, and that's wakefulness. That's awareness. That would be mindfulness. But it's not easy. None of what I've been saying is easy. It's simple, but it's the hardest thing in the world. And it's very easy to idealize it and think I should be feeling a certain something when I finish listening to this music, relaxed or more easygoing or whatever. But we're working here at, in some sense, giving ourselves space to actually be free in the present moment. And if the music is a distraction or is just a calming device, then the wisdom will not arise. So here's another invitation. It's fine to listen to music, but what about if you just listen and let the world music be music, including noise? And notice that noise is also just sound. And can you be in wise relationship with sounds that you don't like or that are not so harmonious or whatever? And so you're asking a very profound question, and it really comes down to, again, using the sense of hearing as a door, one of many, many doors. You can use any sense in this way into your own wakefulness. It is a very arduous discipline, what we're talking about. This is not easy. It's simple, but it's not easy. So any way that you can align yourself or join this love affair that works for you is a good place to begin. And then in the end, and I'll close with this, the meditation practice in the beginning stages, it's more like you think that you're doing the meditation, that you're being a good boy or a good girl, and you've taken your 45 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, and you're doing the meditation. If you practice for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, after a while you realize you're not doing the meditation practice. It's more like the meditation practice is doing you, whoever you think you are. And it really does blossom into that kind of not knowing, that kind of wakefulness that's fully embodied and that's not attached to particular ideals of how wise you should be or how kind you should be or how loving you should be. That everything that arises becomes the curriculum. And when you become more transparent to it, you catch that kind of reactivity to collapse into one condition or another, and you can remain transparent and free. So it's not an ideal, it's an ongoing cultivation that has no beginning and truly no end. And music, in terms of sound or whatever, can be a very big part of it, or it can be a gigantic distraction. So I hope that's inspiring to you in some way to see for yourself, just as you're a scientist. All meditation practice is about really seeing for yourself. So it's as much a science as it is an art. See for yourself. And as the Buddha put it, be a light unto yourself. So I'm very glad, and I will just close with this, to have had the opportunity to spend some time with you. A lot of the people on this program are people that I really have known for many years. Antonia Submundo for one, Roshi Joan Halifax for another. There are people whose work I know, but I don't know them personally, that I have high regard for. And I really wish you all the best with this conference, the first conference of its kind in Hungary, and I'm sure it will not be the last. At this confluence of Dharma and science, and medicine and wisdom and ethics. And in a way, I have to say, I'm sorry that I won't be able to participate and learn during the whole conference, because I would love to. Garbor, I would ask you if you could just send me the program brochure or the book so that I can have a sort of feeling in my hands of what you've given to everybody. And I just want to thank you all for your attention this morning. Apologize for having gone over. I know you have a tight schedule to adhere to, and just wish you well, and just say, if anything that I've said this morning, my time, this afternoon, your time, is valuable to you, that you really will take it to heart and water, as Thich Nhat Hanh likes to say, these seeds of mindfulness in yourself. Not look to outside authorities for some kind of, absolute handed down truth, and inquire for yourself about what wisdom is in the form of you, in the life that you have to live. And in that way, mindfulness will flourish, because we're in some sense all taking a distributive responsibility for this work together. So I want to bow to you all and thank you from the bottom of my heart for your attention this morning, and wish you all the best for the next 2 days of your conference together. I don't know how to say goodbye in Hungarian, but I will say it in French. Au revoir. Goodbye.